Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk about the cell membrane and what it's made out of. And we're going to start our discussion on how the cell membrane regulates what can enter and leave a cell. So first, let's touch bases on the fact that all cells on Earth are surrounded in a cell membrane, both prokaryotes as well as eukaryotes. Every single cell on Earth has a cell membrane surrounding it. Now, that cell membrane can also be called a plasma membrane as well as a lipid bilayer. Now, some cells, like a prokaryote or a plant cell, or a fungi, like a fungus cell, may also have a cell wall. So a cell wall is different than a cell membrane. The cell membrane or the plasma membrane or the lipid bilayer is what is it's thin and it's flexible and it regulates what can enter and leave a cell. Versus a cell wall is oftentimes for structure and support. It's more rigid and it's on the outside of the cell membrane. So let's go ahead and talk about, there's the cell membrane. Okay, so let's go. So from the smallest prokaryote to the largest eukaryote, every cell is surrounded or enclosed by a cell membrane. So when you look at cells and their membranes, so the cell membrane is going to separate the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. So anytime a molecule needs to enter or leave the cell, it's going to travel through that cell membrane. So here's like a molecule that needs to enter the cell, or sometimes you might have a molecule that needs to leave the cell. Okay, so we'll learn how that happens. And so basically, the cell membrane ultimately controls or regulates what can enter or leave the cell. So, but how can a membrane regulate, right? So that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Like, what is the lipid bilayer actually made from, and how does that actually control what can enter and leave a cell? So the building blocks of the cell really are important in controlling or regulating what can enter or leave. So here we have what is called a phospholipid. So the red part is made out of a phosphate group, and then the blue part is made out of lipids. So when we talk about phospholipids, there's two parts. You have the phosphate group, as well as the lipids. So here we have a phospholipid, and it basically is a phosphate group with two fatty acid tails. Now, that phosphate group region is polar. And if you haven't had chemistry yet, polar means it's attracted to water. It's water-loving. And then the tails, the fatty acid tails, are nonpolar, which means they repel water, or they basically repel water, water-fearing. So when we look at these fatty acid tails, they go back to our lipids unit, and lipids are one of the macromolecules that repel water. So these two fatty acid tails are lipids, and they do not mix well with water, and they repel. Okay, so when we look at these, again, you have the polar phosphate group, which means like water-loving, and then you have the nonpolar fatty acid tails, which means water-fearing. Okay, so, and if you're in a higher level science class, you could use the words hydrophilic for water-loving or hydrophobic for water-fearing. So let's go ahead and talk about, why is the cell membrane in two layers? Like, why is it a bilayer? So here I have one phospholipid. And when we look at the cell membrane or the plasma membrane, here we have one row of phospholipids. So if you think about this, the cell membrane, though, is made of two rows. And so the question becomes, why? Like, why is the cell membrane made of a bilayer, like two layers of phospholipids, right? So when we think about cells and their environments, all cells are surrounded in water or an aqueous solution. And the inside of all cells are water. So the cytoplasm is majority water. So here you have a cell surrounded in water where the inside is also water. So if you think about it, the way the phospholipids are structured, these yellow parts, that phosphate group heads, they're water-loving. So it makes sense that each layer, the part that is attracted to water, is touching the water on the inside and the outside of the cells. And then those fatty acids that are lipids that repel water are facing each other. away from where there's water. So if our cell membrane only had one layer, that wouldn't work because you would have these tails in contact with water. So therefore, we have a bilayer. So that way, the phosphate group heads are touching the water inside, and the phosphate group heads are touching the water on the outside. And the nonpolar tails are facing each other away from water. Another important characteristic of the cell membrane is that they are fluid and flexible. So the phospholipids are constantly in motion. They have the consistency of like a thick salad dressing. Think about if you pour ranch over your dressing, over your salad, how it like is thick and viscous. That's kind of like how they're flexible. So they move, they're fluid, they're flexible, they are not rigid, they're not like stuck. Okay. So I also want to point out right now, this video is mainly focusing on the phospholipids of the membrane, but there are also proteins located within the phospholipid bilayer. And we'll discuss the functions of these proteins in other videos. So we'll talk about the protein channels and their role in membrane transport when we talk about facilitated diffusion and active transport. Then we'll talk about proteins some more when we talk about how cells communicate. But for now, I'm going to focus on the lipid bilayer and how the phospholipids themselves regulate what can enter and leave a cell. Okay, so now how does that lipid bilayer with two layers of phospholipids, how does that regulate, right? So if we remember, that center part is non-polar, it repels water. So small molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide that are also non-polar. So they're like the perfect examples. Basically, as we breathe in oxygen, as our cells produce carbon dioxide, these gas molecules are able to cross right through that lipid bilayer. So let me play that again for you. So as like we breathe in oxygen or we produce carbon dioxide within our cells, these gas molecules are also nonpolar, so they can cross through that nonpolar center that is made out of fatty acid tails. So when we talk about like why this matters though, is because when we talk about how molecules can enter or leave a cell, one of the ways is diffusion. And diffusion is simply when molecules move from a high concentration to a low concentration without using any energy. It's due to just random collisions and random movement. So in my slide here, you can see there's a high concentration of oxygen outside the cell, but a low concentration of oxygen within the cell. So as these oxygen molecules randomly move, so we can kind of see here, like as they kind of randomly move and bounce into each other and collide, you're going to see a net movement of oxygen into the cell. Could the oxygen move in either direction? Of course. Oxygen is small and nonpolar and can just go right on through that membrane, kind of like air through a screen on your window. Like the air can come in, like if there's a breeze outside or wind, that air can come in, but then it can flow right back out, right? So it's kind of like that. The oxygen can just go right on through the membrane in either direction. But if I actually like count or measure or pay attention to the overall movement, if I start with a high concentration on the outside, after the molecules are kind of colliding into each other and able to move in both directions, you find you have a net movement of oxygen into the cell. So that is diffusion. Oops, let's move my face. So when small nonpolar molecules move from a high concentration to a low concentration, this is called diffusion. And this is one of the ways oxygen moves into our cells, with the way carbon dioxide moves out of our cells. And so small nonpolar molecules can enter or leave a cell by diffusion by moving from a high concentration to a low concentration based on just random collisions and like an overall movement to where there's less of them. Okay, so I'm going to stop my video here and make a separate video to go into more detail with other types of transport that require the use of those proteins. So in the next video, we'll focus on the proteins and how they work. Okay, good job.